I will be dividing this list into sections of my overall enjoyment of a game. In order, these will be adequate, okay, good, great, amazing, and masterpiece. Also, let's remember that these are my individual opinions on a variety of games. As such, it's statistically impossible for you to agree with this ranking. Just remember that it's in no way official and not worth getting weird about. And just so the lowest entry doesn't shock you, these are only the games I liked enough to finish. Life's too short to play Suicide Squad. Without further ado, let's begin. Starting with our first adequate game, Dragon's Dogma 2. My favorite genre is open world. Nothing is more enjoyable to me than exploration in a digital world. Dragon's Dogma 2 feels like a game that is designed to make me hate my favorite genre. Because Dragon's Dogma 2 is one of the worst offenders of my personal biggest sin a game can commit, wasting my time. This is most apparent in the lack of fast travel, which is inexcusable without some kind of unique traversal or dense amount of things to discover in the open world. Dogma has neither of these, nor does it have a narrative I would call particularly interesting. It also has some design decisions that are made solely to torture the player, to the point where even Dark Souls 1 would say that's pretty messed up. Namely the singular save slot and Dragon's Plague, which can only cause misery for the player. Dragon's Dogma 2 is one of the most difficult games I've ever played, and it's the worst kind of difficulty because it never tested my skill, but it frequently tried my patience. Add on top of that the banal vomit of ceaseless dialogue from my pawns, and adding extra fast travel items as a microtransaction, and it easily cements Dragon's Dogma 2 as the worst game I finished this year. However, the combat is phenomenal and so cinematic that I've had battles I will never forget, like going for a ride on the back of a griffin in a non-scripted encounter. Next is Black Myth Wukong, and I'm going to stop right here and say it's not the game's fault, it's mine. I'm just not a fan of games designed to punish the player and drain me of my mental energy. Not challenging games, mind you. I love hard games that get you right back into the action, but when death comes with the penalty of slogging through fodder enemies to get back to where I was, only to get immediately lost since there's no map, and you're going to mentally exhaust me. My biggest issue with Black Myth, as I said, is the awful navigation. The areas are too sprawling with innumerable invisible walls blocking your way. Add on top of that no map, compass, waypoint, or anything to help guide you, and finding your way to the next boss fight becomes a slog. But when you get to that boss fight, it's all worth it. I love that you can't block the boss's attacks. The game forces you to play it the way it wants you to. This means that the boss fights have a much tighter design, and you can't cheese a boss with a certain playstyle like you can in Dark Souls. Said bosses are also absolutely gorgeous. The Chinese mythological design exudes such a holy presence that demands respect in the same way that the boss's attacks demand learning the pattern. The final game in the adequate category is the Plucky Squire, which is a game I feel didn't live up to its exciting concept and mechanics. Zelda is my favorite franchise of all time, because it strikes the perfect balance of introducing a new mechanic, using it in increasingly complex ways, and then quickly moving on to the next mechanic before it gets stale. Plucky Squire boasts just as many mechanics as Zelda, but it fails to use any of them in an interesting way beyond their initial reveal. For example, this word-swapping mechanic is the basis for one of the best puzzle games I've ever played, called Baba Is You. But the Plucky Squire reduces this mechanic to a simple match the right word to the right sentence in order to solve the puzzle. Essentially, it's trial and error. The story is also definitely not written for me, so it's not fair for me to offer criticism, but the side characters did begin to grow weary on me. But then again, I played this entire thing on a 10-hour night flight from Tokyo on a Nintendo Switch, so maybe that's why it didn't grab me. What I adored about this game was the atmosphere. The pure whimsy of Plucky Squire evoked a deep nostalgia in me for a time before video games. It captures the messy imagination I and all young boys had in our infancy, and that really made me appreciate the emotional tone the game was trying to evoke. I just wish it was able to build on its ideas, instead of mimicking the mind of a young boy of how they quickly grow bored of things and move on to the next. Moving on to the good category, my first entry is Rise of the Ronin. This is in contention for the best combat of the year, perfect for those who need another hit of Sekiro, or those who are put off by the punishing nature of FromSoft. It has the same reliance on speed and intensity, but less focus on precision, which makes this more of a power fantasy than Sekiro, which to some might mean it's more enjoyable. Although I still think it's outmatched by Ghost of Tsushima's combat, but it certainly has Ghost beat in its open world, with far more substantial and in-depth side content that makes exploration feel rewarding, not to mention the sublime traversal. In terms of story, it suffers from the same issue Black Myth does. It expects you to be familiar with the source material, namely Japanese history. It introduces too many characters that are indistinguishable from one another for any non-history buff to reasonably keep track of, though Ryoma remains a standout for the entire runtime. The issue with Rise of the Ronin is that the most important parts of a game, story and combat, are done much better by two other titles, offering little reason to play this one. And of course, the repetitive nature of the missions eventually wear you out and turn the game into a slog by the end. Next is Pacific Drive, whose biggest point of praise is the unique and cerebral atmosphere and concept behind the game. There's a hostile serenity to Pacific Drive. The world is still treacherous, but you're safe or maybe scared in the knowledge you're alone out here, with no sentient life to attack you. I imagine this game is much more effective on an older demographic, interested in automobiles, and I can totally see someone being absorbed into this game for weeks. For me though, the gameplay loop just never grabbed me, because when something went wrong, which granted was always my fault, it ended up costing me a lot of time to fix, and failure to escape the zone in time results in you losing all the items you gained while exploring, and like I said, the thing I can't stand in games is wasting time. I think this is the first game on the list with a story I actually enjoyed, although it has the Firewatch problem where it feels as though the game will culminate in you meeting an important character, and then it just abruptly ends. I guess chalk this one up to being another one just not for me and my tastes. The final good game is Star Wars Outlaws, which is also my biggest disappointment of the year. I was really hopeful about this game when the director said he was aware of Ubisoft's biggest issues, but it turns out all he meant was towers. Outlaws is another Ubisoft open world, which is definitely my guilty pleasure, but I know it's not good for me. Where someone else gets a dopamine rush from completing a battle pass, I am addicted to clearing up my quest log in these games. They're such bite-sized side activities that are always mildly enjoyable enough to motivate you to do the next one. But there's nothing of substance to this gameplay, and no true sense of discovery and exploration, which is what makes open worlds my favorite genre. While I could care less about the storyline, Outlaws has some amazing Star Wars characters. Kay Vess has all the false bravado I would expect of a Han Solo type, but she's much less distant than Han, which makes connecting with her character much easier. And ND5 is a droid who wears a jacket. Do I need to say more? If yes, you're a fool, but I'll oblige. He's a droid who's a well-rounded and fleshed-out character who doesn't play up or acknowledge the fact that he's a droid. If AI were a real-world minority, I would call him an excellent example of representation done elegantly. But I can't in good conscience tell you that there's anything particularly unique or exciting about Outlaws. However, I'm a Ubi open-world junkie and I need my fix. The first game I'd classify as a solid good is Banish's Ghosts of New Eden, which was another excellent idea by Dontnod on how to make effective choices in games. I won't get into a whole rant about how choose-your-own-adventure games have no real choices, because the lack of interactive gameplay means that it's impossible for the player to be punished for their decisions, but just like Vampire, Banish's is the antithesis of that issue. The choices you make in the game feel so impactful, and you can easily tell that these decisions were the genesis of the game's concept. The episodic nature of solving paranormal cases also prevents the main story from becoming stretched too thin, by having the player make choices that affect the whole game. This creates some excellent contained narratives, but it ends up costing the main plot thread dearly. By spending such little time on our protagonists, they end up becoming forgettable and fading into the background, as the haunted NPCs become the star of the show. For me, this culminated in the ending when I realized I didn't care what happened to Antea, as I never felt like I connected with her. The combat was serviceable, but it wasn't the game's strong suit. Next is Mario and Luigi Brothership, which made massive strides in fixing one of my core issues with JRPGs, the repetitiveness of battle. While Mario RPGs have always had the timed button presses to keep players on their toes throughout the course of battle, once you master the timing, they only serve to prolong the fodder fights. Where Brothership changes up the formula is with its plug mechanic, which provides constant buffs and passive effects to combat. The key is how the plug will break and repair itself on its own, meaning the game forces you to experiment with different combinations and encourages experimentation to add more variety to combat. By the late game, you're switching between so many styles that no 3 battles in a row are the same, and even though most JRPGs have moved on from turn-based combat, I hope someone out there innovates on this brilliant idea. The issue is that this mechanic is 10 hours into the game, and everything before that is one of the most painfully monotonous JRPGs I've ever played. With grating side characters and antagonists, plus a plot that in Nintendo tradition takes itself way too seriously for something so uninteresting, and I'm not surprised to see that no one remembers the game 2 months after it released. Next is Silent Hill 2 Remake. Now, I was a bit dubious to put Silent Hill 2 on the list, because I've played the original, so I can't give it any points for storytelling when I'm already familiar with its iconic tale. To someone who played the remake first, I can understand how you think it's one of the best horror games of all time, but for me, I have to judge it in comparison to what came before. And I do think the original is far more subtle in its presentation. It's a game that allows the oppressive atmosphere to wash over and eventually drown the player in an oppressive despair. In comparison, the remake has an overemphasis on combat, constantly presenting enemies for you to survive against. Said combat is wonderfully clunky to match James's depressive and desperate style, but the heightened tension makes it harder to become immersed in the brilliantly realized tone. What the remake far and away improves on is puzzle design. There's no more moon logic or inane solutions, applying real-world logic to these psychologically dizzying puzzles. And all the new original puzzles by Bloober are so indistinguishable in quality from Team Silent's originals, I had to go back and double-check they weren't in the original game. If this was an original game and I could give it points for narrative, it would be much higher on the list, but I can't do so in good faith, so it remains in this lower position. The next entry is SteamWorld Heist 2, whose biggest achievement is being the first game since Final Fantasy V to really get me invested in a job system. I've always found job systems to be supplemental and overwhelming, offering an insane amount of skills and playstyles to choose from, yet the starting job of your protagonist is usually tuned to be able to get you through the game with no problem. SteamWorld solves this issue by making the level cap for your jobs much lower than you would expect them to be, meaning it encourages you to switch jobs frequently, as your units will definitely be too weak to beat the game if you only stick to one class. Furthermore, it keeps the reserve XP you gain from over-leveling a job, so as soon as you switch, you gain the most useful skills in your new job, because switching jobs usually means getting rid of most of your skills, disincentivizing switching once you reach more challenging opponents. Of course, there's the engaging combat, which is all about lining up impressive trick shots on your opponents, which leads to some of the most satisfying strategies in the TRPG genre, and of course, the colourful presentation. Where Heist 2 falters is that it's too long and samey for its own good. While that initial experience of mastering the system is a phenomenal one, by the end it's worn out its welcome, because the game is too long and hasn't built on that concept enough. Next up is Warhammer Space Marine 2, and I feel I should clarify that I only played the single-player campaign, and have no experience with the online modes or anything added to the game post-launch. the high point is undoubtedly the combat, with the sickeningly beautiful crunch and impact needed to convey the overwhelming might of these hulking characters. It makes me nostalgic for these overly scripted, tightly paced 10-hour action games that we are sorely in need of in the modern day. What sets Space Marine apart from other games with an intense action playstyle is the Horde style of combat that essentially puts you up against a wall of alien flesh and allows you to tear sinew from bone in a gloriously gory fashion. While I'm not all that familiar with the Warhammer universe, it does an excellent job at telling a narrative that's easy to connect with and accessible to newcomers. Even more impressive is how well it introduced this complex universe to me. I'm probably never going to start painting minifigs, but this game made me spend a couple afternoons on the wiki absorbing the tantalizing lore. The biggest issue for me is how the campaign drops off in the back third of the game when a new antagonistic faction is introduced that simply isn't as fun to fight against as the Xenos. Maybe it's just the increased number of bulky enemies halting the blood-soaked flow of tearing through mobs, but I found the pacing of battle significantly dropped off when these enemies took center stage, though I'm sure it was awesome for the people familiar with them. The penultimate good game of the year is Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, whose strength comes from its gorgeous presentation. This might be the first game I could describe as a Western anime, as the exaggerated effects behind the attacks and animations scream with the visual garnishes many of the highest budget anime of today are blessed with. I would also praise this game for its mere existence alone, as Ubisoft is almost exclusively focused on live service slop that's reprehensible, and open world slop that I scuff down like a good little sow. But The Lost Crown was a rare, smaller budget and wonderfully artistic game that I thought they weren't interested in making anymore. Turns out I was right, because they shut the studio down, from what I'd assume are either unrealistic expectations, or maybe I don't hate my own generation of young gamers nearly as much as I need to. But regardless, The Lost Crown is easily the most visually stunning Metroidvania since Hollow Knight, and it emanates its pristine style from every angle. The weak point is the predictable narrative and one-note main character, which usually isn't a problem for the genre. Sadly, Lost Crown makes an earnest effort to tell an engaging story, and ends up falling flat on its face. I swear my eyes almost rolled into the back of my head when the main villain revealed themselves. The best game in the good category is Metaphor ReFantazio, which brings all of the gorgeous stylistic tendencies Atlas is legendary for, as well as the best protagonist and main antagonist they have ever produced. In fact, I have double reason to hate Luis, because my name is Louis, spelt exactly the same, and whenever they said his name in a text box with no dialogue, it really took me out of the experience. The game is also the best Atlas has ever done with role-playing, allowing full, unrestricted customization of every party member, whilst not overwhelming the player with choice like job systems tend to do. The social link characters also take on a far more mature theming than I'm used to in these games, dealing with things like prejudice, grief, and guilt. While I don't find those subjects as relatable as personas, I can certainly understand how they can be far more impactful to players who have lived a much harder life than I have. But that relatability is where Metaphor suffers the most. The party members, which have always been the highlight of Persona, simply failed to grab me in the same way. None of them seem like characters I want to be friends with, and sadly fall on the more generic side of JRPG parties, something I thought Atlas was the master of avoiding. And of course, like all Atlas games, it's one dungeon too long and wears out its welcome by the end. Now we enter the great games category, and coincidentally, this is where the top 10 begins. So let's talk about number 10, Stellar Blade. Stellar Blade's biggest win is the sublime combat that certainly demands skill, but never requires it to beat a tough boss. With easily the second best parrying and gaming behind Sekiro, Stellar Blade's offense-heavy combat ensures that you never have to play defensively, which is my personal preference. Stellar Blade's other biggest success is the insanely stylized character design of its protagonist. She is loud, proud, and doesn't care what anyone thinks of her and how she dresses, and will kick your ass if you do, an absolute girl boss through and through. The problem is that personality-wise, she's as flat as a washboard. She has no expressiveness or emotion to back up the attention-grabbing design. If Eve had the personality of a hypermaniac moe girl with a cocky attitude, she would be one of the most stylish characters in the medium. But as it stands now, her utterly generic personality is an insult to her strong, independent, and confident design. It also doesn't help that the story she's in is just as bland as her, and it's frankly embarrassing how much certain plot points ripped off Nier Automata. Ninth best is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which is maybe the most authentic movie-to-game adaptation since Spider-Man. Like Silent Hill 2, it uses a deliberately clunky combat system as a way of conveying the main character's fighting style and places a de-emphasis on action. It also has the best villain of the year in Emmerich Voss, who, like all Nazis, is frankly disturbing, but that whimsy in his voice just truly paints him as a sickening freak. Nothing in Silent Hill 2 made my skin crawl more than him whispering joyfully in my ear with his forked tongue. But the best performance has to go to legendary actor Troy Baker, whose rendition of Jones is eerily perfect, to the point it's unfathomable that he's not a young Harrison Ford. I'm so impressed that they tried to differentiate themselves from Uncharted by making the game slower paced, but at the same time, I question the decision for open world sections. These places just aren't interesting to explore, and harm the pacing of the game when the entire plot hinges on racing to find the artifacts. If the entire game was like the Himalayas and Shanghai levels, then this would have surpassed every Tomb Raider game and Uncharted game save A Thief's End. As it stands now, The Great Circle is a much different experience and definitely requires me to replay it while ignoring all the side content. At 8, we have Hellblade II: Senua's Saga, a game that is so raw and unrestrained in its performances that they can be frankly unnerving. Of course, the leading lady rightfully deserved her award, but to the multitude of VAs playing the voices in her head, I tip my cap. They genuinely freaked me out with their whisper screams that infected me throughout my playthrough, creating a terrifying sense of immersion. It's easily the most absorbing game of the year, thanks in no small part to said performances, the expert pacing, and gorgeous visuals. Though I don't like to praise games for visuals when they're the reasons games cost so much and means we have to wait longer for them to be developed. Which brings me to my favorite part of Hellblade, the length. A solid 5-hour adventure with absolutely no filler whatsoever. A game like Hellblade 2 is the reason Game Pass should exist. I dream of every month Microsoft putting out a game that can be beaten in a weekend that causes me to keep my subscription year-round. The biggest problem with Hellblade 2 is that it's a game whose concept came from a narrative idea rather than being built on gameplay. As such, the interactivity of Senua's Saga can feel limited, as the title plays more like an interactive film. So when the plot enters a slower story arc, there's nothing to supplement that section of the game, though they did a phenomenal job improving on the last game's combat. In 7th is Astrobot, which may be a surprising placement for many of you. Astrobot's biggest strength is the frequent creativity it puts on display, moving from one mechanic to the next as fast as a true 3D Mario would. It has a few misses across its many levels, but they're quickly forgotten about beneath the avalanche of ingenious stages that will have you swear this game was graced by Miyamoto himself. This is a Nintendo game through and through, my favorite kind of game as you'll see in a higher ranking. But despite how much Astrobot owes to its rival, it's able to stand on its own and harness the console itself in a way that would never have worked on another platform. The crowning achievement of Astrobot is the end credits, which will overwhelm you with sheer elation unless you're dead inside or an Xbox fan. The thing that holds Astrobot back for me is the over-reliance on nostalgia. While it's easily the selling point of the game, and make no mistake, I collected every single one of them, it does bury Astrobot beneath a wave of other identities that end up diluting the essence of the franchise itself. I know that might seem harsh since the cameos did tickle me, but if franchises like Star Wars and Pokemon get criticized for their heavy focus on their yesteryears, we have to call out when a game uses all these iconic characters as a marketing tool instead of selling the game on its own merits, which it was more than great enough to do. In 6th, we have the second biggest surprise of the year for me, the campaign of Call of Duty Black Ops 6. I had long since given up on Call of Duty campaigns. I assumed they were all mindless shoot-em-ups that lasted 5 hours and charged full price. But Black Ops 6 floored me with not only these spectacular set pieces, but a massive variety of gameplay styles that felt like the game was trying as hard as possible to create engaging and varied gameplay, incorporating genres from the likes of stealth to open world, culminating in a level that's a cerebral fusion of Doom, Control, and Left 4 Dead, making for one of the best FPS levels since all Gillied Up. I don't know just how much of my praise comes from just how far it surpassed my expectations, rather than its own merits, but for a game I only tried out on a whim thanks to Game Pass to elicit genuine interest into going back through the previous campaigns, this franchise has absolutely won me over. My largest criticism would be the story. While it's rather standard, what especially stands out as an odd choice is just how much it relies on previous installments. I might be wrong, but I doubt even the most hardcore COD players are genuinely invested in the overarching narrative of these games. So relying so heavily on previously established characters is a puzzling choice. The 5th best game of the year is Dragon Age the Veilguard. Veilguard is easily the best combat BioWare has ever produced, visually spectacular and dizzyingly diverse with build potential, and finally making me actually engage with my companions' abilities instead of letting them wander freely. While said companions might be a contentious topic, I adore how expansive the companion quests were this time around, consisting of multiple quests that built a full character arc, where previous games would have presented a single quest per companion and moved on. While I don't think they're the best party BioWare has ever produced, they're without a doubt the most nuanced and in-depth, with the exception of Garrus, Tali, and Liara, but that's only if you look at the trilogy as a whole. I can sympathize with many longtime fans who were displeased that the series transitioned to a more lighter tone, but there have been so many franchises that have gone gritty and ended up losing the magic that made them special, so it's nice to see a series go in the opposite direction. The biggest failing of Veilguard is how the story is barren of meaningful decisions. The plot is almost entirely linear, and not once did I even pause to consider the ramifications of a major choice, because I feel like one never presented itself. If Dragon Age had simply removed any choices from the game and told a linear narrative, it could have easily been in my top 3. At number 4, we have Like a Dragon: Infinite Wealth, which is easily the second best Ryuga Gotoku Studio game behind Zero. This new turn-based combat is the perfect remedy for one of the franchise's biggest issues, the exhaustive cutscenes. See, the problem with the long-winded dialogue has always been that the game never rewarded you with meaty gameplay, as the action combat quickly sent you back to the cutscenes. But this tactical combat means that Like a Dragon can now continue its dense narrative because it breaks it up with multi-hour dungeons, creating a true JRPG experience. Said combat also includes QTEs to do more damage, which at this point, if your turn-based game doesn't include these, then the only plausible excuse is a nostalgia play. Add on top of that the series' insane humor and best boy protagonist Ichiban, and the frankly insane amount of side activities that the series is somehow still able to maintain despite the ludicrous increased length and output of these titles, and you have what may arguably be the series' crowning achievement, that respectfully ends the tale of the best autistic character in video games, Kazuma Kiryu. Criticism would be the aforementioned cutscene length, but at this point it feels like shouting at the moon, because these games refuse to tell a less complex story. The best game in the great category, third best overall, and biggest surprise of the year for me is Shadow Generations. Look, if COD in 6th and Veilguard in 5th didn't make you leave, then you only have yourself to blame for getting this far in the video. So this shocked me, because I haven't played a lot of Sonic games, and especially because I didn't find Sonic Generations all that amazing. Like Astrobot, it relied too heavily on nostalgia, but this time it was for titles I hadn't played and as far as I can tell were mostly disliked. But Shadow Generations' levels are much faster and way more demanding than I found Sonic's levels. The problem I've always had with Sonic is that they mix in slow precision platforming with the speedy bits, and they have always killed the pacing of the level for me. Shadow Generations simply puts the slow moments in the overworld and lets the levels be a non-stop 5-minute ride of distilled excellence, creating some of the most replayable levels in the franchise's history. It's a game you can finish in one sitting and has almost no fat on it. This is the type of game I wish the industry could strive towards. My biggest criticism would be the story, which is predicated on you having played what I understand to be the worst game in this entire franchise, which is saying something, and also how Seed's story takes itself so seriously when the protagonist is an edgy cartoon hedgehog. In second place, and the only game in the amazing category this year, we have the biggest snub, The Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom. I don't understand how this franchise is incapable of missing. They pivoted hard away from this style of Zelda because they thought the formula was getting generic, and then they dropped their first original dungeon-based Zelda in a decade, and it's higher quality and more inventive than the sequel to their first open-world game. The Echoes mechanic is simply baffling from a design perspective, requiring so much work to implement and offers so much freedom it's daunting to ponder. I would go so far as to put it on the same level as the portal gun in terms of puzzle-solving mechanics. Mix that in with the first Zelda game where the leading lady takes the starring role in order to emphasize the momentousness of this mechanic, and you have a game that should be talked about in the same breath as A Link to the Past. In terms of criticism, honestly, the biggest issue is the UI design of the Echoes menu, making it cumbersome to use echoes that you haven't used in a while. Finally, the only game in the Masterpiece category this year, my game of the year, and since we're halfway through the 2020s, my game of the decade so far, is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, a crowning achievement in my favorite genre of all time, open world. When I played the original and walked across its world, it was up to my imagination what secrets were hidden beneath the low poly textures. Rebirth reveals that my imagination wasn't up to snuff, because the world is brimming with discoveries, which are often fully fledged minigames rather than a collectible. This is the realization of actual fantasies people had when playing the original, and in my mind, this one section of the remake is better than the entire original game. The mix of turn-based and real-time combat has been perfected with the addition of combo moves, making sure the most iconic party in JRPG history gets the time to shine in combat. The relationship building mechanic allowing for so much more depth that this legendary cast deserves, brought to life by good voice acting in a JRPG, which is a startling rarity. While it has a healthy dosage of nostalgia, what makes Rebirth surpass the original is the rejection of that nostalgia, how it's determined to break away from that comparison and tell a story that overwrites its source material, a writing choice of disturbed levels of confidence. My biggest criticism doesn't even make itself apparent until the literal final scene of the game, which I won't go into here due to spoilers, but if that one scene in the grassy hill was done differently, this could very well have been in my top 10 games of all time. I will be back in a week, as now I need to go make all of the shorter videos that you're used to, so your regularly scheduled bi-daily programming can resume. And if you want me to go more in depth on my biggest Rebirth criticism, click the box on the screen.